This is the Motherlands podcast. The intention of this podcast is to provide evidence-based information through honest conversations on fertility, pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and beyond by bridging together the two worlds of allopathic medicine and holistic practices to improve the reproductive health outcomes of women. I am your host, Keely Semler. Hi, welcome back to the Motherlands podcast. Before we begin the next episode, I thought I'd take a moment to say I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who's listening and tuning into these episodes. Integrity has always been and will continue to be the focal point for the Motherlands podcast. The intention was to share honest resources from practitioners as well as stories from women I know and trust who are doing incredible and meaningful work within women's health. But I'm now realizing that this podcast is so much more than that, and I'm just so grateful that you're here with me, so thank you. It's been an unusually busy spring. Not sure if any of you out there can relate, but I've been busy welcoming new babies into the world and supporting my birth clients. And as we all prepare and welcome the beginning of summer, I am longing to slow down and enjoy some lazy sunny days at home. I do have quite a few amazing guests lined up, and new episodes will be released later this summer. And I know it seems silly, but the ratings and the reviews do mean so much for this little podcast. I read every single one, and I'm just so touched by how many of you are sharing episodes with friends and family, so thank you. One final note, I am now calling in media support through partnership or sponsorship for the Motherlands podcast. I'm going to be honest. At first, I was not sure that sponsorship was something that felt authentic to me as a host. We all know of podcasts that try and sell things nobody wants or needs. I'm super sensitive to that. And this podcast has never been about making money. In fact, this podcast has been solely funded by me. But I have become open and curious to this idea, especially if it is a partnership that is genuine and offers listeners something of quality and support to women. So if you work for a company or you know of a business that is in alignment with the mission of improving the experience and the quality of maternal health outcomes, I would be delighted to be in touch. Feel free to send me an email, hello@keelysemler.com. When it comes to being a woman, pleasure is not really something as a culture we are taught to explore or prioritize. For Marissa Correia, it is her passion to share about the importance of pleasure in our lives and how it allows us to be more connected to our bodies and our environment. Marissa is a somatic experiencing practitioner, former birth doula, and offers courses on understanding the menstrual cycle as well as the nervous system. We discuss the meaning of embodiment, a word that seems to be trending at the moment, but what does it actually feel like to be embodied? The way she uses language to explain how the body is intricately connected to the earth is just so beautiful. For example, we discuss Earth-based Wheel of the Year and its significance and correlation to a woman's menstrual cycle. There are cycles around us and within us, and Marissa invites us to take pause and notice all the ways we can honor and support these rhythms. By nature, we were not designed nor meant to be living in such a fast-paced way every single day. I really hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, please rate and leave a review. It's incredibly helpful and such an easy way to support the Motherlands podcast. Thank you. Have a beautiful week. As an American, I think about how most women are not really taught about what pleasure is. We're constantly being told how to be a good woman or a good mother or a good wife, which is a whole other topic of conversation. But I'm wondering, how do you define pleasure, or what does pleasure mean to you?
Yeah, I really love this question because it is something that kind of inevitably comes up when doing any kind of work around pleasure. As you named, especially in American culture and dominant culture, there is this need for like high sensation to be able to feel something. And so a lot of times, there's this excess, this consumption without really being able to feel what we're receiving or what we're taking in. This inevitably comes up of like, how do I discern between what is just that urge to feel good all the time and feel kind of entitled to just feeling good all the time versus this sense of embodied pleasure. And this question tends to come up a lot around like sex or food, these things that can become a way out of feeling rather than a way into feeling. And so I think that's like the best answer that I've been able to come up with in terms of like, what is embodied pleasure? What is the quality of it? And what can we look for when we're trying to discern what that is that we can look for, does this bring me closer to myself? Does this bring me more into my body rather than more out of my body? And we have very good reasons for wanting to get out of our bodies, and sometimes that's necessary, that relief. Like sometimes that's the best we can do, and that's okay. But in terms of having an embodied pleasure practice, I think that what to look out for is, those little and big pleasures that make it easier for you to be in your body or make your body feel like a more pleasurable place to be rather than a, fire hose of sensation that can kind of blast us out of our bodies. Thinking about like, what are those little bits of pleasure that can kind of trickle in and soften us into our bodies and help us feel more rather than feel less.
Mm. And so you use the word embodied and embodiment, and I think that it's a lovely word, but for listeners that may hear this word and not really know what that means, can you sort of explain that? Like what embodiment really means, what that feels like?
Yeah. I also think that is such a great question because it is like quite a buzzword right now. And just by the nature of social media and the internet, and it's hard not to conceptualize it through a framework of like what it looks like. And again, in, dominant culture, there is this focus on how do things look and, looking embodied. But I think embodiment really is just the capacity to be within one's own skin. And I know that can sound really abstract, but I mean it in a really kind of literal sense of, those moments where we can really like feel ourselves underneath our skin, where we can feel that space, that awareness within our own bodies. And so there's really no one way that it looks or one way that it sounds or one way that it needs to be. There's really no qualifier that can come from outside of each individual person. It really is just about being able to be in our own skin and be in contact with our own viscera, and our heart, our belly, those sensations, those little tingles that we get in the belly or, the heart dropping or the rush of heat that can come with different emotions or the coolness that can come over us, these different ways that our bodies respond. And it's tricky because a lot of times embodiment sounds like this really great thing, and it is, of course, but it can also, all of these sensations can also be really overwhelming, especially if we've spent a lifetime learning how to ignore them, learning how to suppress them, or kind of needing to suppress them and prioritize other people's feelings and, being able to track other people's body language and the environment around us in order to feel safe. Tuning into these sensations and noticing, what's happening under my own skin can be really overwhelming and really uncomfortable at first. Yeah, it is this like re-inhabiting or inhabiting our own bodies. And there's a lot that can come up with that. It's like returning to a neglected relationship or a long lost connection. There might be layers of grief, of rage, of sadness, of confusion. So, of course, my work is dedicated to helping people come more into their bodies, because I do feel like that is the way through so much of the personal and collective problems that we're facing is this disembodiment. But I also think it's so important to really name and honor that it's not all rainbows and butterflies coming back to the body. Yeah, it's a relationship, I think, is really what embodiment is, a relationship with ourselves. And disembodiment, even, or a sense of disconnection from the body, also gets to be included in our understanding and definition of embodiment. Because if we didn't understand that we're on some level inside of these bodies for a reason, and have this organic technology for a reason, then I think, that's the only way that we can really even have a framework for disembodiment or dissociation or disconnection. So I think it's helpful to kind of understand it all under the umbrella of embodiment, and each of our individual and communal, cultural relationship to body, and what it means to be in a body.
That's really helpful. You used to be a birth doula, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
I'm wondering, talking about embodiment and being in the body, what was your experience in birth like? What your experience taught you about birth, especially when we're thinking about embodiment? I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that, rather than embodiment teaching me about birth, I think birth taught me about embodiment.
Hmm.
Yeah, I credit so much of my approach to how I, work with people now in trauma resolution and coming back to the body. I credit so much of that to my birth work days and my time learning from and alongside midwives, and that way of holding space for the intelligence of the body, this sense that the body knows how to give birth. And that doesn't mean that it's not really challenging, just how I was speaking about embodiment doesn't mean that there's not all these layers to it, but that there's an intelligence that's moving towards life, that's moving towards wholeness. And yeah, the way that traditional midwifery might hold space for a birthing person, having that sense that this body knows what it's doing. And what the midwife's role is to create the conditions in which that intelligence can do what it innately does.
Hmm.
And that same thing is true with the nervous system, which I think the nervous system is really like this interface between our bodies and our, the autonomic nervous system being this below conscious awareness, kind of opening and closing, moving towards and moving away from response. And our prefrontal cortex are more kind of the things we might identify as more like human brains, are meaning making and analyzing and organizing things into systems. The nervous system being that interface, it works the same way, I think, in the sense that we always have a good reason for doing what we're doing. I believe our systems are always trying to move towards health and to move towards life and to move towards wholeness. And how our systems are doing that are dependent upon our internal and external environments. Yeah, birth really taught me how to hold space for people in that way, to really truly know that their system knows what it's doing and has an intelligent reason for what it's doing. And there's nothing that, I know that they don't know that I need to tell them so that then they can change, but rather helping create the conditions in which their system can do what it actually wants to do, which is move out of protection and towards connection.
Yeah, I believe that as well, especially attending births, both within a hospital setting and at home and at birth centers, figuring out ways to support the conditions that make someone feel safe inside
Mhm.
enough to soften so that they can be embodied, so
Mhm.
that they can birth their baby, because it's really, really hard to birth a baby if someone's afraid or feeling like they need to fight or defend. And I find that sometimes the hardest way to prepare someone is that very thing. And if someone's waiting for birth to start to think about these things, it can be quite challenging.
Mhm. Yeah, and really, unfair, I think, for birthing people to, think that we should be able to just click into that because we're giving birth. Yeah, midwives say like we birth the way we live,
Mm-hmm.
um, something like that. And yeah, so there are all these ways that we can start to really like from the edges tend to, yeah, our relationship to fear, how we respond to fear, what happens when we feel under threat. And I think the nervous system and nervous system regulation is also such a, buzz topic on social media right now. And I think that our natural nervous system responses can get kind of wrapped up in this like moral value judgment where it's like, okay, fight or flight is bad and parasympathetic is good. Sympathetic is bad, parasympathetic is good. And I need to, not feel that fight or flight energy. And that's a bad sign, or even that's trauma, like that's a trauma response. And that's not necessarily true. We need all of our responses. We need all of our capacities and faculties to respond in real time, if there is a threat, whether that threat is, someone, maybe it's something small, if someone, maybe not speaking very kindly to us and being able to embody enough of that sympathetic charge to be like, hey, that doesn't feel good, or, to kind of direct that dynamic in a way that makes it clear that that didn't feel good, or whether the threat is, something bigger, more life-threatening. We need our sympathetic responses. We need to be able to respond appropriately. And so it's really about having that range of motion within our nervous systems to be able to move in and out of our different nervous system states without getting stuck in any one. So I think that is an important piece in it all, whether we're thinking about birth or just embodiment in general, is it's not about not feeling things. It's not about not having big responses. It's not about being calm all the time. It's about being able to respond to what's actually happening rather than respond from our habituated survival strategies, which might be having a bigger response than is, appropriate to what's happening. And I don't mean appropriate in the sense of decorum or like societal appropriateness, but more so like appropriate in terms of the charge of what's happening outside is matching what's happening inside. So that might look like too big of a response that is really energetically draining on our adrenals and on all of our body systems, to have a bigger response, a bigger fear response, or a bigger protective response. But it can also be like too little of a response, too small of a response when we're thinking more about, a freeze pattern or appease, kind of needing to hide what we're feeling or act calm when we're really feeling angry or scared or upset.
Yeah. I find too that, there's an element of people pleasing that comes up too when we're sensing into our environment, internally and externally, like how we've been predisposed to some degree to be agreeable and not be too much for somebody, or for certain situations. I see that a lot with clients in my work, is discussing what people pleasing can feel like in the body, because usually our body is, will tell us if we're overcompensating. And I feel that also as a birth worker, sometimes I'm like, wait a minute, is this mine to carry or to hold on to? That can be quite a practice of letting go of things that I might be holding on to from clients that aren't really mine to begin with.
Mm.
But one thing I think might be interesting to talk about as well is I really admire how you use language and connections with nature. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about sort of this idea of earth womb embodiment.
Yeah, so through my work as a birth worker, I really feel like I became a student of, an apprentice to cycles. That was a primary way that I began to connect with my body and experience my womb, was through my own cycles, through my menstrual cycle, and starting to track, yeah, the same way we have these 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, we have these 4 seasons. I then also started to learn about the earth-based wheel of the year, which is a kind of modern amalgamation of different earth-based traditions of pre-Christian Europe. So the wheel of the year is the solstices and the equinoxes, and then the halfway points in between them. So there are these points of relationship between the sun and the earth that all earth-based people all over the world have had some orientation towards. And the wheel of the year is one kind of symbolic representation of the way that our earth-based ancestors might have related to, or did relate to, these transitions throughout the year, tracking, the length of day and night, and the way that, yeah, the sun sets in different places throughout the year. What I found is that not only are there these connections between the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle and the 4 seasons, but also even that those in-between points, those cross-quarter days, those halfway points between the solstices and the equinoxes, also align with kind of hormonal transitions between the phases. And I'm not the only person to make this connection. People have noticed this, and one really, I think, easy one to track is the transition from our bleeding time, menstruation, into our pre-ovulatory time, starting to move into that follicular phase where our hormones are starting to return. So when we're bleeding, our hormones are the lowest they'll be all cycle, and we're having that release. And then even as we're still bleeding, estrogen will start to rise again, and all of our hormones start to rise again, and we start to feel usually like a little more energy, a little more interested in the outside world, a little less, down and in. And that transition within the wheel of the year connects to the transition from the winter solstice towards the spring equinox, where we're not quite in the depth of winter anymore, but we're not quite in the fullness of spring yet. And there's this kind of quiet, gentle emergence of new life out of the depths of winter, out of all of that death and that shedding and that releasing. And so, yeah, that tends to be one that people have a connection to, but each transition can connect in that way. Yeah, I think finding that connection and really mapping it out was and is such a sense of orientation, something to orient towards that just is. I think that is what is so powerful about this idea of earth, womb, embodiment is it's cyclical in nature and it's trackable and it's happening, our menstrual cycles, the seasonal cycles, our life cycle phases. It's all happening whether we're aware of it or not. It's not a system that we have to generate, create, effort in order to feel a sense of orientation or containment. It's something that just is. And it's something that always has been. And even in its constantly changing nature, whether within that cycle or even thinking about, things like climate change and the way that our environments change in response to what's happening on the planet, and the same way our cycles change depending on what's happening in our environment, there is still this consistency in it that can be a really grounding and stabilizing force. And I think that is what embodiment can be, is, that same feeling of getting to connect to the earth, getting to feel a sense of belonging and being held by and being connected to, being of the earth over time, our own connection to our bodies and our wombs, whether, the physical organ or that felt sense of a, center within us that's connected to the creative energy of life. Connecting to that can also be a grounding and stabilizing force, and something that we can orient to no matter what's happening around us. Yeah.
I think that there are many women out there that use their phones to track their cycle. And I think that that can be a gateway to understanding a little bit more about your cycle for some people. Although it does feel kind of prescriptive at times, like, oh, tracking your cervical mucus and tracking your temperature. I'm just wondering, for someone who may be interested in beginning to understand the subtleties of their cycle, what are some small steps to start noticing the shifts that occur during each phase of the cycle that might not be what a lot of people are exposed to?
Yeah, it's funny. I resisted using an app for so long, and it mirrors kind of, I used a paper planner for so long. I think it's similar to that conversation around pleasure and asking ourselves, does this bring me closer to myself or make me feel more connected to my body? Or does this make my body feel more like this static thing that I'm trying to control or fix or get something out of? Is it relational or is it becoming like a problem to solve? I think is something to keep an eye on in terms of the different ways that we can track and gather data.
I love that. What a refreshing perspective as you're speaking about the body. And it's almost like having this childlike curiosity with like an open hand, as opposed to gripping, white knuckling our bodies to do what we want them to do. You use the word pelvic bowl, which I find really lovely and interesting. Can you explain why you use this term as opposed to the pelvic floor?
Yeah. I mean, I just love the word pelvic bowl. I wouldn't see the pelvic bowl as quite a replacement for pelvic floor. I think I would say more like pelvic diaphragm as more of a replacement word for pelvic floor. But I think pelvic bowl speaks more to the place within our body where there is this, creative energy, and where a lot of receiving and releasing happens, and a lot of, like the life cycle happens. It's this generative space that relates even to the idea of pelvic diaphragm rather than pelvic floor. If we have a bowl, the bottom of that bowl is not a flat floor, right? It's rounded. And in terms of the pelvic bowl, it's responsive to the pressures, quite literally a diaphragm, if we think about our respiratory diaphragm, is responding to the pressure above and below it to allow for our breath to come in and for our oxygen to move into our bloodstream and for our breath to come out, that inflow and that outflow. The pelvic diaphragm functions very similarly in that it's sensing the quality of pressure above and below and kind of adjusting in order to find the sweet spot, and can be a place where we hold tension if we are not feeling safe or not feeling stable. That, diaphragm, the same way with our respiratory diaphragm, our diaphragm at the base of our ribs, if we're in a state of fight or flight, it kind of can lock up to help us feel more stable. And again, it's that kind of choice between protection or connection, protection or feeling, and both have a place. But in the pelvic diaphragm, there can be a habituated, kind of stuck pattern of tension. And even, we get told like, we need to have a stronger pelvic floor and we need to be doing our Kegels. And we have to kind of unpack even what strength means and how we define strength, because a strong muscle, a strong part of our body, a strong organism is, one that can open and close appropriately in response to what's needed. Very similar to how we were talking about the nervous system. It's less about being able to do one thing and not do another thing, but rather being able to, respond appropriately to what's needed in the moment. And I think what is so beautiful and so tricky at times about this place in the body is that what we're needing is often changing, depending on the life cycle phase that we're in, depending on where we're at in our cycle, depending on if we're, postpartum or are getting ready to give birth or pregnant. It's because it's a place of creation and creativity in life. It is always changing. And so it does have to be relational, our connection to this place. And we tend to want, what is the thing that I do so that this problem gets fixed? What is the solution? It's really not, if we think about like a bowl, it's really this like ecosystem that is changing in its seasonality and changing depending on what's happening in our lives at that time. And so I think the word pelvic bowl gives more of that sense of there's this container, right? And I think the actual bones of the pelvis as this bowl can be really helpful to connect to. I find that it's a really great place to start in terms of pelvic embodiment, of embodiment in general, is to really connect to the bones of the pelvis because they feel solid and stabilizing. You can put your hands on your hips, press in and feel like that's your pelvic bowl. Those are your pelvic bones. Can feel them, you can touch them, you can locate them. And that can have a really like stabilizing effect and help to kind of give a container to starting to come closer into what's inside the pelvic bowl and what is it like to even orient towards or understand the way our organs are organized and connected and fit in together in the pelvic bowl, and how does, our fascia and our nerve endings and our blood flow all move within that space, and how does, my felt sense experience change throughout my cycle or throughout different emotional states, or when I'm feeling really tired or when I'm feeling really energized. Yeah, I think it encapsulates more of a felt sense of what that space can actually hold. I think that this might just be, a me thing and the kind of creature that I am. I love language. I love words. And I do think that the words that we use, the language that we use shapes our reality, shapes our experience, especially of our bodies. And so, yeah, there's a roundness to a bowl. There's a spaciousness to a bowl, but there's also a container. A bowl can hold, you can pour from a bowl, you can put things in, you can take things out.
And there's an openness just what you said too about muscles. In order to build strength or build muscle, a muscle has to contract but also fully relax. And sometimes I think that isn't really talked about very much is the idea of relaxation and how that impacts that part of the body too.
Yes, yeah. And in that way, like our root, our pelvic bowl, our wombs are such a mirror of how we're relating to and treating our bodies and how we have internalized these ideas that we're supposed to just kind of muscle through and ignore cues and needs for release, relaxation, restoration. And I think that that's what can be so frustrating, is because this is a place where we have been disconnected from. And then once we do get connected, it's like, oh, there's pain here, there's discomfort or imbalances, symptoms, ways that our body's communicating to us that something's out of balance and something's needing tending to. Our wombs really are like these little earths that are responding to everything. Yeah, that can be a source of discomfort and frustration, but I think can also become a source of empowerment and context for what we need to nourish and what we need to say no to and what we need to say yes to. And it's like the pelvic bowl doesn't lie.
What about scar tissue? What about
Yeah.
like understanding the intelligence of tissue in general, but specifically scar tissue, as a lot of listeners have given birth or are going to be giving birth? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, scar tissue is the body's way of protecting itself, right? And I think it needs to be honored in that way and related to in that way. It's a way of, creating a tissue that can protect and be a little less sensitive. There's an intelligence to that. And that can happen, through injury, but that can also happen through habituated gestures and body postures and different ways that stagnation happens in the body. There's like emotional scar tissue that can kind of get created where the body registers it as injury, as this need for protection. And so I think relating to it in that way rather than this problem that needs to be solved or this inconvenience again. How do we, through warmth, through the right amount of pressure for, thinking about massaging scar tissue, all of these qualities, like how do we create the conditions in which the body doesn't feel like that protection is as necessary? So rather than like kind of fighting that scar tissue, seeing like how can we help the tissues in that area of the body get to register that the threat has passed or the birth is complete and that there's a new way of being that might be possible in that area of the body. Yeah, thinking about breath and movement and these more kind of functional ways that we can bring blood flow to kind of move that stagnation and kind of melt some of that scar tissue.
Thank you for sharing that.
And I think, yeah, I'll also say that there is a real nervous system component to scar tissue because our fascia is so highly innervated by our autonomic nervous system. And that, isn't just our emotions. It's also, our autonomic nervous system is responding to what we're eating, how we're sleeping, getting what we need. And yeah, I think that is something that can be very overlooked in all things related to the body and to the womb is, people will be like, I'm doing all the right things. I'm eating all the right things, or I'm getting the body work, or, I'm doing to my body everything I'm supposed to be doing. And there's a missed piece often with, well, how are you actually feeling in your body while these things are happening, while you're doing these things? Because we can't like force the body to open. It will create more tension and it will be registered as like a threat on some level. So that is a very important piece with scar tissue of any kind, is being in the place within our nervous systems where our bodies can feel differently and be open to other ways of getting our needs met that don't involve tension as protection.
That's so helpful. Well, it's been such a delight speaking with you. I really love just the way that you explain the body and the pelvic bowl. And I just think it's so refreshing to hear how you talk about the body. I think it's so helpful for listeners. And it's a good reminder for me, especially as I'm supporting families birthing babies. How can people find and connect with you if you want to be found?
Yeah, I want to be found most of the time. Instagram is a good way right now. Yeah, it's just marissa.m.correia is my Instagram. And also my website, marissacorreia.com, is a good way to, I have an email list on there. Yeah, honestly, just reach out, send an email, send a message. Happy to be found and connect, and love talking about all of this. It really is a pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share with friends and family and stay tuned for the next episode.